Chosen one. What if the thing you have been calling a delay was actually the preparation you needed before you could move forward? And what if tomorrow is not about something frightening happening to you, but about finally reaching the point where you can no longer remain the same person you were before? Because there are seasons in life when nothing seems to move. You pray, you wait, you try again. You wonder why certain doors remain closed. You watch other people move forward while you seem to be standing in the same place. And eventually, a question begins to form inside you. God, how much longer? Maybe you have asked that question more times than you admit. Maybe you have smiled around other people while privately wondering whether your season would ever change. But there is something important about the title of this message. It does not say that God forgot you. It says He has been waiting for you. That changes the entire perspective. Because if the waiting was not empty, then perhaps your silence was not meaningless. Perhaps the season that felt like nothing was happening was actually revealing something about you that could not have been revealed any other way. And that is why the word tomorrow matters. Tomorrow represents a boundary, a line between what was and what comes next, not necessarily a literal supernatural deadline, not a promise that something extraordinary must happen at a specific hour, but a moment of decision, a moment when you finally recognize that the old chapter cannot continue forever. There comes a point when waiting has taught you everything it was supposed to teach you. And when that point arrives, the question is no longer, when will my life change? The deeper question becomes, what am I willing to change now that I understand what this season was doing inside me? That is where this message becomes personal, because maybe you have been waiting for God to change your circumstances, but perhaps God has been using the circumstances to change your perspective. Maybe the closed door taught you discernment. Maybe the rejection taught you that not every place was meant to contain you. Maybe the loneliness taught you to stop depending on voices that could never understand your calling. Maybe the delay taught you patience. And maybe the uncertainty taught you to walk without needing every answer first. You may not have recognized it while it was happening. Most people don't. Growth rarely announces itself while it is happening. Sometimes growth feels like loss. Sometimes preparation feels like isolation. Sometimes protection feels like disappointment. And sometimes a closed door looks exactly like failure until you discover what was waiting on the other side of it. So when you hear the words, God has been waiting for you, do not immediately imagine a mysterious event arriving from the sky. Think deeper. What if God has been waiting for you to become ready to receive what you kept asking for? What if He has been waiting for you to stop looking backward? What if He has been waiting for you to release the identity built around what hurt you? What if He has been waiting for you to understand that your next chapter cannot be built with the same fears that controlled your last one? That is the real tension behind tomorrow. Something has to end. Maybe not your life, maybe not your circumstances overnight, but an old way of thinking, an old attachment, an old fear, an old version of yourself. And this is where you need to listen carefully, because if you have been experiencing a strange feeling lately, a sense that something is changing, even though you cannot explain exactly what it is, do not automatically dismiss it. Perhaps you are simply becoming aware of a transition that has been developing for a long time. You may suddenly find yourself less interested in things that once consumed you. You may no longer feel comfortable in places where you once tried desperately to belong. You may notice that certain conversations exhaust you now. Certain relationships feel different. Certain goals no longer carry the same meaning. And you may wonder, what is happening to me? Maybe nothing is wrong. Maybe something is becoming clear. That distinction matters, because sometimes transformation begins with discomfort. The person you are becoming starts feeling uncomfortable inside the life you have already outgrown, and that discomfort can be mistaken for confusion. But there is a deeper question waiting underneath it. What if the reason you cannot return to the old version of your life is because you are finally beginning to understand why you had to leave it? Take a moment and think about the last season of your life. Not the version you show everyone, the real version. What changed you? What did you lose? What did you learn? What did you survive? And what did you finally realize about yourself? If something immediately came to mind, don't ignore it. That may be one of the most important pieces of your story. And if you feel comfortable sharing it, tell me in the comments. What is one thing you know you cannot carry into your next chapter? Because sometimes naming it is the first step toward releasing it. But there is another layer to this. You may have been thinking the question was, when will God finally answer me? But perhaps the deeper question is, what has God already taught me while I was waiting? That question changes everything, because tomorrow does not need to be feared. Tomorrow can be understood as an invitation to stop postponing the person you know you are becoming. And before we go deeper, there is one thing you need to understand about the waiting itself. The reason it felt so long may be connected to something you have not yet recognized. And once you see it, your past may begin to look completely different. Part 2. Why the waiting had to last longer than you wanted. There is a painful truth about waiting. We usually measure it by what we want to receive. But God may be using it to reveal what we need to release. That is why two people can experience the same delay and come out completely different. One becomes bitter, the other becomes wiser. One becomes obsessed with the outcome, the other becomes grounded in the process. One keeps asking, why me? The other eventually asks, what is this teaching me? That second question is where transformation begins. Think about everything you expected to happen by now. Maybe your life was supposed to look different. Maybe you thought a relationship would still be there. Maybe you expected your career to move faster. Maybe you believed a certain opportunity would finally open. Maybe you thought you would already have the answer to the prayer you have been carrying for months or even years, and when it did not happen, you may have interpreted the silence as rejection. But silence does not always mean rejection. Sometimes silence gives you space to hear what noise was hiding. You may have wanted an immediate answer because you were exhausted. God may have been developing your ability to walk without one. You wanted the door to open. Perhaps the waiting was teaching you to recognize which doors should remain closed. You wanted certainty. Perhaps the season was teaching you trust. This is not about pretending every painful event was good. It is not about romanticizing suffering. Some things hurt because they were genuinely painful. Some losses should be mourned. Some betrayals should be acknowledged. Some seasons leave scars. Faith does not require you to deny those things, but faith can allow you to believe that pain does not have to become the final definition of your story, and that distinction is powerful, because the enemy of your next chapter may not be your past itself. It may be your belief that your past gets to decide your future. You can remember what happened without living inside it. You can acknowledge what someone did without allowing them to determine who you become. You can accept that a door closed without spending the rest of your life standing outside it. And perhaps that is one reason tomorrow matters. There comes a moment when remembering becomes different from repeating. You remember the lesson, but you stop repeating the pattern. You remember the pain, but you stop building your identity around it. You remember the rejection, but you stop using it as evidence that you are unworthy. You remember the waiting, but you stop assuming that waiting means nothing is happening. That is maturity. And maybe that is what this season has been producing in you. Not perfection, maturity. There is another thing that happens during long seasons of waiting. You begin to discover what you actually want. At first, you think you want the thing, the relationship, the money, the opportunity, the recognition, the breakthrough. But after enough time passes, something deeper emerges. You start asking, if I receive this, who will I become? That is a much more important question, because receiving something before you are ready can create a new problem. A blessing can become a burden when your character has not caught up with your desire. A door can open while your mind is still trapped in the room you came from. An opportunity can arrive while fear convinces you that you do not deserve it. So perhaps the preparation was not about making the opportunity arrive. Perhaps it was about making you capable of walking through it when it did. And that is why the title says God has been waiting for you. Not waiting to punish you, not waiting to abandon you. Waiting for the moment when you finally recognize that you cannot enter the next chapter while constantly negotiating with the old one. You cannot move forward while asking the past for permission. You cannot become someone new while constantly trying to prove something to people who only knew the old version of you. You cannot build peace while repeatedly returning to what destroyed it. At some point, the decision becomes yours. Not because you control everything, you don't. But you can choose what you carry. You can choose what you believe. You can choose what deserves your attention. You can choose whether your next chapter is controlled by fear or guided by faith. And maybe that is why certain things have been falling away. Have you noticed that? Sometimes transformation is first visible through subtraction. A conversation ends, a friendship changes, an opportunity disappears, a desire loses its power, a place no longer feels like home. And initially, you think, why is everything leaving? But later, you may realize, maybe everything that was leaving was making room. Not every loss is a divine sign. Not every disappointment contains a hidden message. But every season can become an opportunity for reflection. And if you are standing at the edge of a new chapter, you need to become honest about one thing. What are you still trying to resurrect that God may be asking you to release? That question can be uncomfortable, but it can also be freeing, because sometimes the miracle is not getting back what you lost. Sometimes the miracle is realizing you no longer need it. Think about that. There may have been a time when you would have done anything to return to a certain situation. Today, you may look at it differently. That does not mean you stopped caring. It means you grew. And growth changes your definition of the life you want. This is where the meaning of final day becomes deeper. It can represent the final day of making the same excuse, the final day of waiting for someone else to validate you, the final day of letting fear make every decision, the final day of calling yourself broken because something broke, the final day of believing that your story ended where your pain began. Tomorrow becomes symbolic, a boundary, a decision, a declaration that the old pattern does not have unlimited access to your future. And yet there is still something you need to recognize, because if this really is a transition, there should be signs, not necessarily supernatural signs, but changes in the way you think, respond, choose, and see yourself. And those signs may already be appearing. The first sign may be one you did not expect. You are becoming less impressed by what once distracted you. Things that once demanded your attention may suddenly feel empty. You may still enjoy them, but they no longer control you. That is important, because sometimes transformation does not feel like becoming more excited. It feels like becoming less attached. You stop needing everyone to understand you. You stop explaining every decision. You stop chasing people who repeatedly show you that they do not want to meet you halfway. You stop trying to force timing. You start noticing peace, not because everything is perfect, but because your relationship with uncertainty is changing. That is a major shift. Another sign is that you begin recognizing patterns. You notice the same type of relationship, the same fear, the same reaction, the same cycle, but this time you see it before it controls you. That is progress. Maybe you used to react immediately, now you pause. Maybe you used to chase, now you wait. Maybe you used to prove, now you let your life speak. Maybe you used to panic when something ended, now you ask what the ending is making room for. These changes may seem small. They are not. They are evidence that something inside you has moved. And perhaps this is where the phrase "God has been waiting for you" takes on its deepest meaning. Maybe the waiting was not simply for a calendar date. Maybe it was for a level of awareness. For the moment when you finally see what you could not see before. For the moment when you stop asking only for the outcome and begin understanding the person you are becoming through the process. Consider Abraham. Consider Moses. Consider David. Their stories, as understood within Scripture, were not built around instant arrival. There were seasons of waiting, uncertainty, preparation, failure, movement, and transformation. The waiting was part of the story. That does not mean every modern delay is a divine promise, but it does remind us of something important. A person's preparation can be invisible long before their next chapter becomes visible, and that may be happening in your life. You may not have external proof yet, but internally you are different. You are more aware, more discerning, more careful about where you invest your energy, more willing to walk away from what repeatedly cost your peace, more willing to admit when something is no longer right for you. And perhaps most importantly, you are beginning to understand that your worth does not rise and fall with circumstances. That is a powerful place to reach, because once you understand that, you stop treating every closed door like a verdict against you. A closed door becomes information, a delay becomes a question, a disappointment becomes something to process rather than something that defines you, and a new opportunity becomes something you can evaluate with wisdom rather than desperation. This is where many people misunderstand breakthrough. They imagine breakthrough as something exploding into their lives, a sudden miracle, a dramatic change, a perfect opportunity. But sometimes breakthrough is quieter. Sometimes it is the day you finally stop returning to the thing that kept hurting you. Sometimes it is the conversation you finally have with yourself. Sometimes it is forgiveness. Sometimes it is discipline. Sometimes it is saying no. Sometimes it is deciding that you will no longer betray your own values just to keep someone else comfortable. That kind of breakthrough rarely makes headlines, but it changes lives. And maybe tomorrow is not asking you to predict what will happen. Maybe tomorrow is asking you to decide who you will be when it does. That is a much stronger position, because you cannot control every event, but you can prepare your heart. You can prepare your mind. You can become more intentional. You can pray. You can reflect. You can make the decision to stop living as though your worst chapter is your permanent identity. And there is another sign that your season may be changing. You begin to feel a strange mixture of grief and hope. Part of you misses the old. Another part knows you cannot go back. That tension is normal. Growth often asks you to grieve a version of yourself you have outgrown. You may miss who you were, even if who you were was struggling, because at least the old version was familiar. The new version is not. And that is why change can feel frightening even when it is healthy. You know what you are leaving. You do not yet know exactly what you are becoming, so you stand between two worlds. Behind you is familiarity, in front of you is possibility, and somewhere in the middle is faith. If you are in that place right now, don't rush yourself. You do not need to know every detail of the future. You need enough clarity for the next faithful step. Ask yourself, what is one thing I already know I need to do? Not 10 things. 1. Maybe you need to apologize. Maybe you need to forgive. Maybe you need to stop chasing. Maybe you need to begin. Maybe you need to rest. Maybe you need to make a difficult decision. Maybe you simply need to stop telling yourself that nothing has changed when clearly something inside you has. And if you already know what that one step is, write it down. Better yet, if you feel ready, share it in the comments. What is the next step you know you need to take? Not what you wish someone else would do, not what you hope will magically happen. Your step, because that is where responsibility and faith meet. And now we are reaching the deepest part of this message. If tomorrow represents the end of something, what exactly should end? The answer may not be what you expected. It may not be a person. It may not be a job. It may not be a physical circumstance. It may be a belief about who you are, a belief about what you deserve, a belief that your past has already decided your future, a belief that because it took longer than expected, it must never happen, a belief that silence means abandonment, a belief that you have to become someone else to be worthy of the life you desire. And once that belief begins to break, something changes. You stop waiting for permission to become who you were created to become. You start walking, and that is the final revelation. So now return to the title. Tomorrow is the final day. What does that actually mean? It means nothing if you treat it as a magical deadline, but it can mean everything if you understand it as a spiritual and personal boundary. The final day of what? The final day of remaining trapped in an identity built from yesterday. The final day of believing that your waiting made you forgotten. The final day of allowing fear to make every decision. The final day of asking the past to explain the future. The final day of assuming that because you cannot see the road, there is no road ahead. That is the deeper message. God has been waiting for you, not because you were worthless before, not because you had to become perfect, but because sometimes a person must reach a place where they are finally willing to see differently. And maybe you are there now. Maybe you have reached the point where you no longer need every person to approve of your direction. Maybe you no longer need every closed door to make sense. Maybe you no longer need to know exactly when the next chapter will arrive. You simply know that the old chapter cannot be your permanent home. That is clarity, and clarity is powerful, because when you become clear, you become less easily manipulated by fear. You stop running toward every opportunity simply because you are afraid another one will never come. You stop holding on to every relationship because you are afraid of being alone. You stop measuring your worth through other people's attention. You stop interpreting every delay as rejection. You begin to move differently.